All right, so moving on with week 11. Oh my gosh. There we go. Okay, so we had a question on number 4. What new forms of technology were developed during the war? Why did they fail to end the war? So you had advanced machine guns being developed, for example. You had artillery that could fire a artillery shell miles away, like literally miles away. That's, to me, is astounding. And you hopefully watched, if you haven't, please do so, the video on All's Quiet in the Western Front, comparing it to the Napoleonic War battle from Over the Hills and Far Away. You can see how it was very different. And what has happened here is, because of new advances such as machine guns and this artillery and barbed wire, the advantage was really for the defenders. You didn't really want to be the one attacking, right? It was much better, you gotta think about this. These rifles these men carry, they could shoot someone and hit them if they could see them, right? So in the old video, the Over the Hills and Far Away video, there was, the people wore colorful uniforms because during that time period, the guns made a lot of smoke and couldn't fire that far. So you really wanted to emphasize visibility on the battlefield. You wanted to see who your friends were. And you could see, the enemy could see you and not be able to shoot you because you'd be too far away. It was much more important to be able to identify your friends and identify your enemies through all the gunpowder. Here, these guns don't really make smoke. And like I said, they can fire at someone and hit them from far away. So that leads to this kind of change where the offensive is at the disadvantage. You really want to be on the defensive. You really want to be the person who is standing back and letting the enemy come at you and then shooting them. So you had these new forms of technology being developed, and they fail to end the war in part because they really make it so that you want to be on the defense, not on the offense. Well, if you study military history, aren't most wars won by people going on the offensive and defeating their enemy? That's how wars are typically won. Well, if no one can go on the offensive and defeat the enemy, how can you end this thing, right? You can't. Now, people look at this and say, well, people were kind of dumb, right? And that was one issue I brought up in my lectures on this. How could they get in this war that lasted so long and it killed so many people? And I would argue one reason why it went so long and killed so many people was because the people were too smart. So what I mean by this is, you can see here, one attempt to break the stalemate was gas, right? Let's use chemical weapons against each other. Let's use mustard gas, gas that will blind soldiers or kill them outright. And these are British soldiers who have been blinded by the use of poison gas, right? That's a new kind of technology. I mean, it's really cruel. It's terrible to use, but that's a technology that could end the war, right? It could give the advantage to the offense, could allow you to attack and defeat the enemy, could end the war. Well, what happens? People just develop gas masks, right? And they even figured out how to make gas masks for horses. So the problem wasn't that people were dumb. The problem was people were too smart, because whenever a new weapon was developed that could end the war, could give the advantage to the offense, a defensive measure was developed. To give you another example, tanks. Early on, these promised to end the war quite quickly. You got these behemoths made of metal, and if someone shoots them, the bullets will just bounce off, right? So let's just get a bunch of tanks and attack the enemy. Wouldn't that work? And they did initially. But one thing the Germans figured out when the British, this is a British tank, the Germans figured out that they could take like a pickup truck, basically, like an early pickup truck, and just put one of those artillery pieces on it, and they could drive around a lot faster in the tanks and just shoot the tanks. And this worked really well, so that one of these pickup trucks with just an artillery shell, which you can guess is a lot cheaper to make than this big gigantic tank, one of these could destroy a lot of these. So advantage goes again to the defender. So any time that someone came up with a way to try and end the war, to give the advantage to the offense, there was always a counter that then gave the defense an advantage, and you can't win the war on the defense, right? You have to go on the offense. What was the war like for the soldiers? Pretty darn miserable. And that was kind of my point there was, poison gas. It doesn't help in the war. It just creates one new way for you to die and one more way to be miserable, because sometimes they'd have to wear these masks for days. Right? I went to Walmart the other day to go shopping, and I wore like a mask to try and protect myself from COVID-19. And I was at Walmart for like an hour and a half, and darn it, that was uncomfortable wearing just that little cloth mask. And I can't imagine wearing a mask like this for days, but these guys would do that to protect themselves from poison gas. So the war was like, for soldiers, it was miserable. War is generally miserable. It was even more miserable. People seem pretty confident on these questions, but we did have this question: what were the characteristics of the Versailles Treaty? How did it treat Germany? What did that lead to? So the problem was people had to kind of figure out what was this war about, and they had to make it worth it, right? They lost millions of people literally died in the war. It had to be worth something. And so the victors got to decide what the war was about. And they said Germany was at fault. Germany is the bad guy. It's all Germany's fault. And so Germany was forced to accept a war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles that said this war is Germany's fault. Germany has to pay a lot of money to all the different countries that they attacked. Germany was also forced to give up territory. And part of German territory, they weren't allowed to put soldiers along. So there was an area that borders France in Germany, and Germany had attacked France in World War I, so Germans were not allowed to put troops there. So they had to have a demilitarized zone, an area in their country where they couldn't put troops. There were also limits to the German army. The German army was supposed to only be about 100,000 people. As you could, World War I, that was a war in which armies had millions of people. Germans could only have like 100,000. They weren't allowed to have certain naval ships, and they weren't allowed to build an air force. Now, people go back and forth about whether this treaty was fair or not, and whether this treaty helped lead to World War II or not, and so forth. And there's still an active debate about this, and I think that's fascinating because it's more than 100 years later. I don't want to weigh in on that debate. I would point out that the last two things, the war guilt clause and reparations, those are normal, right? When at this time period, the British, for example, when they defeated China, forced China to take the blame for the war, and China had to pay them money. When Japan defeated China, they did the same thing, right? China was forced to pay them money. So that was fairly normal. That's kind of typical. A lot of the frustration, I think, wasn't just with that. It also, even though the Germans were frustrated by that, that was kind of considered normal. These other two things weren't as normal. The amount of land that Germany had to lose was quite a bit. Not being able to put certain troops in their area was a humiliation. The limits to the army was meant to keep Germany as a weak country, and Germans saw that clearly and were frustrated by that. And that meant that they were not part of, there was, in a sense, they weren't establishing a status quo that Germany could live with. And so I do think it created the seeds for World War II, because a lot of Germans were bitter about this. Whether or not Germans had a right to be bitter, I think is not relevant to our class. What is relevant is that the victors got to determine the terms. The terms were, in many ways, very hard on Germany. Relatively not as hard as they could have been, perhaps, but still hard enough that they created German bitterness that would help lead to support for anyone who promised to build a strong Germany like the Nazis. After the Versailles Treaty, there was a communist revolt in Germany. It was suppressed, and Germany would end up becoming a weak and divided democracy, too weak to deal with the Great Depression and too weak to stop the rise of Nazism. How did people try and solve the problems caused by the Great Depression using traditional methods? How successful were they? So the old idea is when you had a Great Depression, one thing to do, or when you had a depression, was to reduce wages. And the idea being, hey, if we reduce wages, more people can have jobs, right? We're not going to try and fire people to cut costs, because that'll lead some people having no jobs. Let's reduce wages so everyone will at least have a little bit. Let's cut government spending. And it kind of makes sense, right? We don't have a lot of money. Let's cut government spending so we can lower taxes so people will have more money. Let's raise tariffs on foreign goods to protect workers. Hey, there's these people in these other countries who are making things cheaper than Americans, putting Americans out of business. Let's put tariffs, remember tariffs like an import tax, on those foreign goods, and that will help keep American jobs. These old ideas had worked in the past, but the economy had changed. Much of the new wealth that had arisen in the 1920s was based largely on international trade. Well, what happens is when you put tariffs on goods coming in, that hurts international trade. If we put a tariff on Japanese goods, then the Japanese will put tariffs on our goods. If we put tariffs on British goods, the British will put tariffs on our goods. And the problem is, a lot of the wealth that had given people jobs in the first place resulted from international trade. But the old ideas prevented recovery because much of the economy had been based on international trade. So the problem is the old ideas aren't working. So they were not successful. These other ideas that people did not ask about did work. Deficit spending, Keynes's ideas, and so forth. The next question was, how did Francisco Madero become president? What ultimately became of him? So Francisco Madero was a believer in liberal democracy. And Porfirio Diaz, the caudillo, the dictator who had run Mexico for decades, had promised free elections. And Francisco Madero ran for president, and Diaz said, well, I think this guy can beat me, so I'm not going to allow free elections. I'll just arrest him. Now, that's pretty convenient, right? If you're running for president and you can just, arrest the guy that's running against you. Now, what happened, though, was Francisco Madero actually managed to escape and would help lead a revolution against Diaz in 1910 that would successfully overthrow Diaz. And then in a fair and open election, Francisco Madero would be elected to become president of Mexico. And Francisco Madero, I can't help but like the guy because he was the real deal. He really believed in liberal democracy. He really wanted a Mexico that included all Mexicans. So he tried to, instead of trying to punish people who had supported Diaz, including the military, he tried to compromise with them. Instead of firing all the generals who had supported Diaz, he kept them on their job. And he was rewarded with that by the military overthrowing him in 1913 and then assassinating him. Right? So I really feel bad for Francisco Madero. The guy tried to do right by his country, tried to use democracy, both because it's great, because it gives you freedom and things like that, but also to unify his country, and he was rewarded by being overthrown, and not only overthrown, he was assassinated. So I always feel sorry for him. This, unfortunately, does not solve anything. It leads to more civil war in Mexico. There's an opportunity, in 1917, a constitution is established, and the question is here, what were the characteristics of that constitution? How and why did Catholics react, and why did the government attack Catholicism? So here was the thing. There were many people in Mexico who want to bring massive change. They want to engage in the revolutions we've been talking about, the political, economic, scientific, and industrial. Now, what happens, though? What do you do about religion when it's connected to the old order? So, we want to build a new political order. We want to change politics. But the Catholic Church is connected to that old political order. So if we want change, the Catholic Church represents kind of an obstacle. And also, we want a scientific revolution. Well, we view religion then as superstitious. Now, in many ways, I think that's unfair to religion. I'm a specialist in religion. But the fact was at the time that many people who emphasized science saw religion as inherently superstitious. So these people in the 1917 Constitution targeted religion to try and reduce its strength in society. Public worship was forbidden. Now, if you are not a religious person, or if you're a Protestant Christian, this may sound kind of odd. Isn't religion something that tends to be private? When you go to a church, you go in the church and you worship. But Catholics had public worship where they would have like outdoor masses, and they would have like religious parades called processions and things like that. Well, this would be illegal. You also, according to the 1917 Constitution, could not wear religious clothing outside of churches. So if you were a priest or a nun, you could wear special clothing inside the church, but not when you left. Again, if you're Protestant, this may seem kind of odd because a pastor will dress like the congregation or maybe a little bit nicer, but a Catholic priest would wear a special outfit, as would a nun. Churches were not allowed to own property other than the church building itself. And in particular, this hit schools hard because you couldn't own a school. In fact, religious schools were illegal. So like Greenwood Christian would be illegal according to this constitution. In addition, if you were clergy, if you were like a priest, you could not vote or comment on political affairs, right? So you lost the right to vote if you were a priest. And you could not say anything about politics. Now, here's the thing, right? If you're a believer in liberal democracy, you look at this and you say, this isn't very liberal or democratic, right? Taking people's right to vote away when they haven't committed any crime, when their only thing is that they are a member of their religious leader. You can't even wear the kind of clothing you want. If you're a believer in liberal democracy, this sounds really weird. And you can guess Catholics were not too happy about this. And one thing we want to stress, during this time period, Mexico was like 95% Catholic. So when you pass rules that many Catholics don't like, that's kind of a problem. So there's going to be kind of peaceful protests against this. This will fail. And eventually what's going to happen is there will be a rebellion by Catholics called the Cristeros. Cristero means follower of Christ. And they were known for their call, Vivo Cristo Rey, which means hurrah for Christ the King. And 1 second. Jun, honey. Stop, hun. Sorry, my son was playing a piano game, and I think the recording was picking it up. So you cannot. So the Cristeros, these people here, who their battle cry was "Vivo Cristo Rey," which means basically "Hurrah for Christ the King." They would launch a rebellion. You can see they're armed, they're fighting, and this rebellion would last from 1926 to 29. It would eventually be defeated. There were even attacks on priests. This priest, Miguel Pro, was accused falsely of trying to attack the government. He was accused of being part of a bomb plot. And this is him about to be executed. Notice he's not dressed as a priest. He's wearing a business suit. And he's been shot there, and they're going up to shoot him in the head to finish this. And I use this very violent imagery because I really want to emphasize, if you're coming from a liberal democrat perspective, this is really weird, right? Why are you shooting priests? Right? Why are you shooting religious leaders? Why are you making these attacks? Well, like I said, if you want political reform, the Catholic Church seems like an obstacle because it was aligned with the old regime. If you want scientific revolution, there's a belief that religion is superstitious and was an enemy of progress towards modernity. There are some problems, like I said, at this perspective, but that is what some people thought. And basically what happened was the Mexican government this time chose authoritarian politics over liberalism. They decided to emphasize the power of the state rather than freedom. So that an authoritarian government that could reform was more important than respecting freedom. Liberalism would increase the power of religion. The purpose here, and think about this, the purpose of the American Constitution was to limit the power of government, to say there were certain things the government couldn't do. The purpose of the Mexican Constitution was to increase the power of government so it could modernize. So a very different understanding of how to do these things. So the next question, how did the Industrial Revolutionary Party bring stability and economic development to Mexico? How did it maintain itself in power? What impact did it have? So the Industrial Revolutionary Party is going to eventually come to power. One thing they do is they back off the whole anti-Catholic legislation. Much of that stuff I talk about is actually in the Constitution, is still in the Constitution of Mexico today. It's just not enforced. And so by backing off the anti-Catholic legislation, that brought stability because Catholics aren't going to rebel now. And in 1934, the head of the Industrial Revolutionary Party, a man named Lázaro Cárdenas, will become the leader of Mexico. And he's going to develop several different policies. One thing he's going to do is engage in land reform. He will basically force people who own a lot of land who aren't using that land to sell that land at low prices. So there were a lot of people who owned a lot of land, and basically, even though they owned land, they didn't use all of it because they wanted to keep prices of crops high. So they had lots of land that they would just leave unused. They wouldn't grow anything on it. And if you're a poor person without land, that kind of makes you bitter. So Lázaro Cárdenas forced those people to sell land they weren't using and then sold it to the poor people at low prices. So that's a challenge to property rights, which is central to capitalism. So you can see Lázaro Cárdenas is not simply a capitalist. In fact, he was a socialist, right? He was willing to ignore property rights. I shouldn't say ignore. This wouldn't really fly in the United States, but he basically was saying, look, you guys, you've got all this land you're not using. You need to share it. And we're going to give you money for sharing it. We're not going to steal it from you, but you got to share it. No choice. He also engaged in the nationalization of oil. What does that mean? Basically, he forced oil companies to sell out to the government. So the government would own oil. He said, oil is an important industry in Mexico. It should not be under the control of individual companies that are just trying to profit. It should be under the control of the government to use for the benefit of Mexico. So we can use it to do things like build schools, to educate our people. That is socialism, right? That's a time of socialism. We're going to force these individual companies to sell out in terms their oil companies. The government will buy them, and the government will control it. Now, one thing I should point out about that, those oil companies were typically American. They were owned by people from the United States, and they were forced to sell, which made the United States upset, but the government just allowed it to happen, said we're not going to go to war over this. And what's also interesting was that Lazar Cardenas had a peaceful transition out of power. He left. One thing about being a leader is you should know when to stop. You should know when you're out of good ideas, when it's time for someone else to take power. So he left. Unlike Porfirio Diaz, who tried to stay in forever. But he was succeeded by someone from the same party. Basically, the party provided stability and flexibility at the same time. Right? The problem with Caudillos, they could bring stability, but they were inflexible. And if you had a bad Caudillo, there wasn't much you could do about it. But in a sense, by having the Industrial Revolutionary Party in power, you could have some stability because you had the same party in power. But you could also have flexibility. If one leader was doing a bad job, you could pull out another leader. And this party would basically be in charge until the 1980s. Now, this limited freedom because they maintained their power in part because they rigged elections. But also they did improve things. They did bring economic development. They did manage to share and deal with that problem we talked about before. Remember how I said Mexico has a lot of revolutions in a large part because land isn't shared? Well, they figured out how to share more wealth in society that brought more stability. So people were willing to accept them being in power and rigging elections in part because they made life better. And you can see this between 1940 and 1970, per capita GDP went up 3 times, right? If you're someone whose income triples over a period of time, you're probably going to support the government. And there are the terms. People didn't ask about the terms, but there they are.